University.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and as a massive medieval enthusiast, you shouldn't be too surprised that I was rather interested in a recent movie that's just been released on Netflix entitled The King. This is a film depicting the rise of King Henry V and his great Battle of Agincourt. Now, Netflix already has a rather successful medieval film entitled The Outlaw King, which I actually gave a glowing review. The Outlaw King was done really well, and I was very surprised with the lengths it went to achieve certain elements of historical accuracy, both in the events, the depictions of the battles, and in the arms and armor that we see. And even the clothing as well. Outlaw King was a really well done film. The unfortunate thing is, The King isn't nearly as good. There are a lot of problems on many levels, and this, breaks my heart, because I want to see great medieval films made, depicting a medieval period accurately, which is why I loved Outlaw King, but The King, there are a lot of issues, and I'm going to go into it. The first major problem with this movie is that it can't really decide whether it is a film dramatization of the historical events of, King Henry V, or the Shakespearean play Henry V. And it fails at being an accurate adaptation of either. Now, I haven't read or watched film adaptations of King Henry V, but I am somewhat familiar with the history of this time period, and that's what I'm going to be judging this film against. But not only that, just also its efficacy and enjoyability as a film separate to the historical period. But a lot of the enjoyment you can get out of these historical films, in my opinion, is actually how well they depict the historical period they're based in. And so if it fails on both levels, well, then it's a particularly awful film. And like I said, I kind of feel this film does. Now, when I criticize something in this film for being inaccurate, if that element is actually being accurate to the Shakespearean play, I don't care. I criticize Shakespeare as readily as I'll criticize this film for being inaccurate to the historical period it is supposed to be depicting. And Shakespeare took a lot of liberties, alright? You should not look to the Shakespearean story for historical accuracy. And just to let you know, major spoilers from here on in. At the beginning of the film, we are given this shot, which is the fallout of one of the battles between the English and Scots. It doesn't have too much relevance to the story the film is actually trying to tell. The character we're watching right now, we find out to have some strong disagreements with the current King of England, which is Henry V's father, Henry IV. And they've only really put it in the film to give Henry someone to fight against, to show that, look, he can fight, basically, to try and establish him as a character where he would be invested to. But the problem is, this retelling, this depiction of Henry V, he has no character. He is so bland. And this is one of the, flaws, problems, and you might even say weaknesses of historical movies, is that they seem to be reluctant to give historical figures actual character. Now, with all the flaws that we can lump at the foot of Braveheart, one of the things that we can compliment Braveheart on is that it's an enjoyable film, okay, and they gave William Wallace a lot of character. Was it accurate to his character? Well, there was a lot of inaccuracies about his history and upbringing, but we actually don't have huge amounts of information about these historical figures' temperaments and stuff, and so in regards to that, to actually make a workable film, I feel it is, acceptable to fill in those gaps as best you can. I feel we should try and remain true to historical accuracy, but when liberties do need to be taken, I feel we can take them. My issue is when you take these liberties in lieu of what we actually do know historically, especially when what we know historically works perfectly fine. I'm going to speak more in depth about the weapons and armor a little later on when it comes up, in the big fight between Henry and the other guy, basically. But before I get there, I need to address a fairly big inaccuracy, I feel, that they have shown in regards to Henry's character. And it is that they have depicted him as basically a drunken lout, okay? And this is, again, going off the incorrect Shakespearean assertion that Henry V had a riotous youth. The historical record actually paints a very different picture. And that depiction also contradicts another significant element to this film, and that is the relationship between Henry Henry and his father. In this film, they are shown basically loathing each other, okay? And no, they had some disagreements, but they didn't, well, the historical account doesn't really indicate them outwardly loathing one another, especially since that one of the things that they show in this film, that Henry's father denies him his right to the throne. He says in this scene that Henry will not inherit the throne and that his brother Thomas will. That's completely incorrect, okay? No, Henry was always the heir to the throne, as was his father's wishes, okay? And the animosity that is shown between Henry and his brother Thomas here doesn't seem to be confirmed by the historical account either. In actuality, Thomas seemed to have supported his brother Henry and even fought for him in some later engagements in the 100 Years' War. Thomas wasn't there at the Battle of Agincourt, and he didn't die before Henry took the throne, as the film shows. The film shows the king giving the throne to his brother in lieu of Henry, and then his brother dying in some battle. It doesn't show the brother dying, just saying, your brother is dead, now you're heir to the throne, be against your father's wishes, and the father and Henry hated each other. This is all bullcrap. It didn't happen. Thomas lived well after Henry took the throne. Henry actually fought alongside his father when he was 16 years old, and when he was 16, he actually took an arrow to the face, just slightly off to the side to his nose. They do give Henry the scar that he was well known to have, but they put it on the side of his cheek when it was actually next to his nose, according to historical accounts. When his father became so sick that he couldn't actually fulfill his duties as king, Henry came in and basically took up the slack, but he enacted different foreign and domestic policies that his father disagreed with, which resulted in his father dismissing Henry from that role, and his younger brother came in and filled that role until his father's death. But when the king died, Henry became the new king. There was no time in which his king was saying his second eldest son, Thomas, would take the throne. The film seems to be depicting the time in which, after Henry was removed from his kind of managerial position, taking the role of king while his father was sick, and then it seems to be showing that there was a great, personal disagreement between the two, and that Henry was basically outcast. The thing is, the film only gives the briefest lip service to the type of policies in which Henry was enacting. Now, Henry wanted to forgive a lot of the noblemen that had a strong disagreement with his father. He wanted to kind of unify England and bring it under a more peaceful rule. But the other big policy that Henry IV didn't want Henry V to go through with was going to war with France. Henry V wanted to go to war with France before he even took the throne. This is very important because in the entire film, they are showing Henry being wholly reluctant to go to war with France, when in actual fact, Henry wanted to. And he was trying to do it before he was even king. So this is a massive contradiction to the personality and intent and desires of Henry V in this film. This is already a fairly big difference between this film and Outlaw King. Outlaw King seemed to have gone out of its way to include important historical elements in the events and in the personalities of the characters they were depicting. Even the small things like the swearing by swans and raising the dragon banner, those were really just beautiful and respectful nods to the historical period in which they come from. Those things actually happened, and they're in Outlaw King, but that seems to have been thrown out the window for this movie. And it's important for me to review, as I reviewed for the Outlaw King, but don't worry, I am going to get to the battles and the weapons and armor. It's just that this is also really important as well. It's the whole reason for the conflict. There'd be no battle to review and weapons and armor to assess if these events didn't happen the way that they happened historically, and that the historical figures acted the way they did. And they happened due to that nearly traditional conflict between England and France, and as to who owned certain parts of France, because so much of the English monarchy had legitimate claim to lands in France. Do you remember William the Conqueror? Do you even know about William the Conqueror, who conquered England in the 11th century? Well, he was from Normandy. He was French, okay? And he had full claim and right over at least Normandy, but thanks to later negotiations and marriages and other things like that, it became a lot more muddled. Now, if you'd like some basic chronology to connect the events of Outlaw King to this movie, The King, and even if you don't want it, I'm going to do it anyway because it's really interesting and actually helps us understand what's going on a bit. Remember the bad guy in Outlaw King, Edward I, Longshanks, right? He had that fairly pathetic son, Edward II. Well, Edward II's son, Edward III, wasn't nearly as pathetic. He was actually pretty darn tough. He had some major victories against the France. One of the big famous ones is the Battle of Crécy. Upon Edward III's death, the throne was inherited by his grandson, Richard II. And Richard II was a pretty lousy king. He got the throne wholly too young, and even when he grew old enough to kind of take the reins of leadership over his nation, he still made a lot of bad decisions, and under his rule, the English lost a lot of lands to the French, undoing a lot of the work that Edward III had achieved. By the way, Richard II is not Richard the Lionheart. Big difference. Richard II was ultimately dethroned by Henry V's father, Henry IV. Henry IV was also the grandson of Edward III. And it is that Henry IV who is the father of Henry V, Henry IV usurping the throne from Richard II, who lost a decent amount of the lands that the English crown had rule over in France because Richard II was a lousy king. It is those lands that Henry V wanted back. He felt they rightly belonged to him and the English crown, which is the whole reason for his ultimate declaration of war and invasion. Now, the English did claim that the French had mocked them and insulted Henry V personally. This was after Henry took the throne, by the way. And it's those accounts that gave Shakespeare the inspiration for the whole tennis ball thing that we see depicted in this film. That the French king sent Henry V tennis balls saying that he was just a boy who played games, or, you know, just all the other subtext that goes along with it. That never happened in real life, okay? All we have to go off is the English claim that the French mocked them and insulted Henry personally. We don't know the specifics. Another decently valid reading of history, and I'm not saying it's the correct one, I'm just saying it is also valid, is that these claims were fake and that the English were just saying them to give them more cause to go to war with France, but they didn't really need any more cause apart from a legitimate claim to those lands. And in actual fact, what seems to be more likely is that Henry V saw an opportunity in France's weakened monarchy. The King of France was going insane, okay? He actually believed that he was made of glass. And with the weakening French monarchy and with the rightful claim that England had over these kind of hereditary lands in France, principally being the Duchy of Aquitaine and other holdings in France, like Normandy, Henry V saw this as an opportunity, which is why he declared war. Not this ridiculous, by the way, I should have probably said this at the beginning, I'm going to reveal a fairly big spoiler. They kind of held this back to be a big kind of twist reveal at the end, so I'm going to spoil that. You've been warned, I'm going to continue on, okay? That whole subplot of Henry being manipulated into war with France is bullcrap, okay? Doesn't look to have happened historically, and in my opinion, it weakens Henry as a character and ruler, that he was just, you know, an immature, unlearned, unprepared boy on the throne who was manipulated into this war. To me, it was a baffling addition into the film. It weakened the character, it was unhistorical, and for those reasons did the opposite of elevating this film to a higher level. Henry didn't regret his invasion of France, quite the opposite. It was a massive success for him and paved the way for later victories as well. Under the reign of Henry V, England reclaimed many French lands that they felt were rightfully theirs. And as to who had the right claim on these lands, it's a complete mess because the English and French monarchy intermarried, pledged, you know, lands to each other and everything like back and forth. It's just nuts. And also, just an additional kind of interesting thing, the English monarchy spoke French all the way up until Henry V's reign. Henry V, of course, could speak French fluently, but he was the first English, ruler who actually chose to speak English in his court. Before then, it was all French. There was a good number of English monarchies who actually lived in France for the majority of time when they actually had rulership over those French lands. Some of them, like Richard the Lionheart, didn't even like England. So the mixing between the French and English monarchies is so fluid that to claim that there was a distinct difference is very tenuous. You basically can't do that. You could nearly call them all French before this time, all the way to William the Conqueror, who had rulership over England and some parts of France at different times. So there's a lot of inaccuracies, and I just want to round off what I was saying about Henry V not being a drunkard. Before he claimed the throne, he fought in several battles, he was well educated, and was a shrewd politician and ruler with legitimate experience in the role. Very different to what the film shows, which just basically depicts him as a drunken lout who has no experience or interest in rulership. The general depiction of the medieval period in the film is mostly disappointing. It's kind of gone back to the drab, dirty, muted colours that Hollywood just seems to love to depict this period in. Gone is the colours that we saw in some instances in The Outlaw King, but even The Outlaw King was still a little too muted. The medieval period was colourful. They loved colour. In fact, colour was a sign of wealth. If you have a look at how many of the castles were painted on the inside with murals and everything like that, it's an absolute riot. There's colours and paintings everywhere. And so, again, this, movie, it's just gone back to everyone's wearing browns, greys, muted colours. It's like they didn't even believe the medieval period had sunshine, for heaven's sakes. Even in this scene where Henry is walking outside with his sister, it's like, look, I know England is a lot more cloudy than other parts in the world, but heaven's sake, there's still sunshine, but it seems like they've purposely muted the colour down in this film. And of course, they're just wearing greys because, medieval people don't like colour either. I mean, at least they're clean, but still, my goodness, they could have done so much better. And that's with the general depiction of what we're seeing. They do a lot better when it comes to the depiction of the weapons and armor. Now, it's not to say it's perfect. The armor, especially the plate, look, it's good that they're showing mostly period-appropriate armor for the time this movie is based in, but we still do see some just poor executions of that armor. The armor looks very unfitted, untailored, okay? There are some instances where the armor is going too far down on the waist. I mean, this shot here, this guy, it's good. He is wearing a painted breastplate, so okay, yes, they did paint their armor in certain circumstances in this time period. But the other thing is, it seems like they think this was the only armor type, all right? Well, no, brigandine was very popular during this time period, and on top of just wearing plate, they also wore tabards over on top of their armor, so it wasn't just painted, which seems to be the only thing that they've done here. There's no tabards on top of armor that we see anywhere, and there's no jupons either. Now, jupon is an additional layer of fabric armor on top of metal armor. We do see some gambesons among the poorer soldiers, but if they were actually trying to get better armor, they wouldn't then go to mail, and we see a decent amount of people just wearing mail in this film. If they could go to better armor up from gambeson, it would then go to, say, like a coat of plates or brigandine, not just full mail or just what we see with the gambeson and the mail coifs. Henry's armor here looks particularly bad. I mean, it looks unfitted, the breastplate is way too low, and it's not the type of armor that a prince would be wearing. The weapons, on the other hand, are mostly pretty good. We see a decent amount of polearms, and the swords that these guys are wearing are long swords, and absolutely, this is kind of the beginning of the longsword heyday, absolutely. So, two-handed longswords, definitely. Though there seems to be a distinct lack of arming swords, and the arming sword was absolutely still used during this period. I might do a full fight scene autopsy of the fight between Henry and this other English nobleman. I don't know if this battle specifically, or or if both leaders of the armies decided to go into one-on-one combat. And from my reading of history, I actually find that this practice wasn't really done, or at least wasn't done commonly. When it comes to warfare, the notions of chivalry like this weren't really, I mean, they would save the lives of the nobility for ransom, so the idea that they wouldn't kill noble blood was less about chivalry and more about money, although Henry V himself certainly didn't follow that practice after the Battle of Agincourt, which was a very controversial action during the time. And they were more interested in overall victory, and so forfeiting their victory based on a one-on-one duel, no, didn't really happen, though trials by combat absolutely were still practiced in this time. Henry V's own father, before he came to the throne, had a massive dispute with another English nobility, and to settle the dispute, they agreed to go into a trial by combat that was ultimately called off by the king of that time, Richard II. So trial by combats absolutely happened, but combats to determine the outcome of wars and battles, I haven't read of that happening with Henry V. Please do correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't researched every single battle Henry V was in, but the ones that I have read, it was never even a consideration, especially Agincourt. And in this film, before Agincourt, they show Henry approaching the leader of the French armies, which they show to be Prince Louis, Prince Louis? He wasn't even there at Agincourt, okay? But Louis is there in the depiction of this film, and Henry goes to Louis and asks them to fight one-on-one to save, the lives of their soldiers and stuff like that. Didn't happen. Did not happen. In fact, both sides were so intent on victory. Well, the English were forced to fight. They're actually trying to retreat, but the French army caught up on them and the English couldn't outrun them, and that's why they were forced to fight. So short of doing a full fight scene autopsy on this fight scene, I will just say that the style of fighting they're employing is basically single-handed longsword technique while in fully armored. They're not fighting as if their opponents are in full armor with these swords. I like that it degenerates into some grappling and wrestling. That's brilliant, okay? So points there. I kind of like that it also degenerates into more, I guess, undignified brutality with the punching and stuff. And I love how Henry wins the fight ultimately, but my main criticism overall is that most of it is, well, when they're fighting with the swords, isn't the right style of fighting, but I do like many of the other elements. It's great that they're using guard positions. I would have liked that both opponents were using a different guard position, not the same as each other. There is one point where Henry does half sword, so that's good to see, but it doesn't last long. I love that his opponent pummels him with, the quillins, the side of his sword. So there's some really good elements here. I love that Henry pulls out a dagger, and, that was an interesting thing where he falls back and trips up his opponent, so that's a good move, and then stabs his opponent right in the neck. The dagger was one of the more prominent weapons used to defeat armored opponents historically, so I loved that they showed that. So overall, I think the fight scene had more positive elements than negative elements, so good on them for that, but there is a decent amount to criticize in the execution of the armor that we're being shown here, and the larger scale battle. The coifs are not fitted very well to their faces at all. So that's unfortunate. They basically give Henry no personality at all. He is so bland and dull. Now, as to the details of Henry V's personality, we don't have a huge amount. So like I said, it's in these instances where you kind of need to fill in the gaps to make an interesting film, especially a film in which we want to be interested, at least, in the main character. Again, that's one of the things that I liked about Outlaw King. They gave Robert the Bruce some personality, and he was still fairly bland, but at least he's smiling and joking in some instances. There was better characterization on nearly every level in Outlaw King, and it was still fairly bland considering, though I will say I kind of like Edward II's over-the-top rage and passion and stuff, and so for a character that you wanted to function as an antagonist, the depiction of Edward II in Outlaw King was done really well to achieve that. The only interesting character in this movie was Prince Louis, played by Robert Pattinson, and I kind of like Robert Pattinson as an actor. His accent was fairly strong strong, and there's interesting kind of reviews both criticizing it and saying it was perfect. I felt it worked alright, especially for his character. It was very strong, but as to his personality and characterization, he is depicted as being pretty evil and, ruthless. Not a lot is known as to Prince Louis's personality at this point, but if you want full historical accuracy, Prince Louis wasn't even there at Agincourt, okay? He wasn't quick enough to get ready, and by the way, Prince Louis, he died 2 months later, so perhaps that's why they put him in the movie, because they show him actually getting killed. He's the main antagonist, and they show him getting killed in this movie, so perhaps they just grabbed Prince Louis, even though he wasn't there, because they needed a villain, and he died 2 months later anyway, so have him die in the battle for the sake of storytelling. So as I mentioned before, they depict Henry being wholly reluctant to going to war with France in this movie, and that it takes several significant events to push him over the edge. First being the insult of the tennis balls, which is again a Shakespearean thing based on the English claim that Henry was insulted personally. But then they have an assassination attempt, or staged assassination attempt, to try and get Henry to go to war, because it's his main advisor who wants Henry to go to war, and Henry doesn't want to go to war. Historically, there was never a French assassination attempt, although there was a plot against Henry's life, not by the French, but by 3 other English noblemen to usurp him and put Edmund Mortimer on the throne. Edmund himself had no knowledge of the plot, but it was uncovered and those 3 men were beheaded. This film seems to have reappropriated that attempt against Henry V's life as a French plot. And then they show a beheading, but it's a beheading of 2 English nobility, not the 3 that were actually trying to kill Henry and usurp him with someone else on the throne. Like I said, Henry wanted to go to war with France. So unfortunately, this film is already riddled with inaccuracies and lacks the kind of finesse, the, respectful nods that Outlaw King has. We basically see no real medieval customs or practices, and that was such a highlight for me in Outlaw King. None of that is here. And then we come to some of the battles, and once again, the battles are no exception. The Siege of Harfleur is rather odd and different. One, the castle that they're besieging in the film doesn't look to be a port city at all. It just seems to be a castle on a hill. So there's a big problem there. This should be the Siege of Harfleur, and the most upsetting thing about this is that the Siege of Harfleur is such an epic historical event. If you ever want to look at one of the great sieges of medieval history, well, the Siege of Harfleur is one of them. It has so many different stages and elements, and one of the big interesting things about Harfleur specifically, it was one of the first big medieval sieges in which gunpowder was employed in a very large measure. That's right, what I'm saying here is cannons were actually used in this siege, not okay, there might have been some trebuchets. There's references to mechanical artillery, which might denote trebuchets, but the primary weapons used to bombard Harfleur were cannons and the earliest types of medieval firearms. That would have been so interesting to show, but it seems like, because this is set in a medieval period, Hollywood just thinks guns never existed in the medieval period when guns were actually introduced in the medieval period, and knights did use them for, sieges and battle and other things like that. As far as we know, guns were not used in Agincourt, the large battle after, Harfleur, and that might have been because they ran out of gunpowder, perhaps. But no, Harfleur was completely pummeled with cannon fire and gunfire. And again, this is another reason why, the Siege of Harfleur is so interesting. It didn't fall. I mean, the outer walls were riddled with holes and stuff. Some sides collapsed. There are accounts of the English being surprised that the French held out so well. They would fire back through holes in the walls and even on rubble and from areas that they would just, didn't think anyone could get to and shoot back from. It was a long siege. The English ended up suffering from dysentery. Henry thought about digging underneath the walls, but the length of the siege we are shown in the movie is them just sitting around using trebuchets, throwing rocks and fiery things at the walls, and that's it. And they even talk about assaulting the walls and that, no, that'll be too great a loss of life, and that there was no assaults, when there actually was, okay? There were active assaults. There were sorties that the French sent out to take out forward bastions that the English had built to set up certain siege equipment and stuff like that. So the French were sending out sorties, and the English, they did a large assault and they took the outer Barbican, and this was a big turning point in the siege. It was going on for months, and then they launched a big assault, okay, with men, and overtook the outer Barbican. And it was in taking the outer Barbican that the French finally surrendered, okay? The real historical siege was 100 times more interesting and engaging than what they showed here in the film. There is one positive thing I will say about the siege, and it's not even the actual fighting, okay? It's pretty, cool to see big trebuchets launching projectiles and stuff like that, but we have seen that before, and like I said, the historical one was a lot more interesting. But separate to the fighting, which isn't really fighting, it's just trebuchets throwing things, there is a conversation between Henry and one of the bishops or whatever, higher up, religious authority comes, and he says, why not just go around?
Surely you cannot simply idle here until they decide to come out.
That is precisely the definition of a siege.
See, I like that line as well, because, that is exactly what it is. See, there is a lot of waiting in sieges, but to think it was only waiting, there is a lot of active things happening, like sorties, continued bombardments, changes in strategies like sapping, digging underneath the walls of a castle, dealing with supply lines and sicknesses. They had dysentery, like I mentioned, and then, of course, final assaults and all that. But still, a lot of movies and sieges thinks it's only assaults, and I do like that this movie at least shows that a lot of sieges is waiting around, even though, like I said, there's a lot of interesting things that happens in between. There's still a lot of waiting.
Well, then why do you not simply go around? If they insist on hiding in their castle, why do you not simply go around it?
The reason why I like the bishop or whoever he is asking that question is that that's actually a common question a lot of people ask when it comes to castles. Why don't they just ignore the castle and go around? And to answer that, I made a whole video dedicated to that very subject, entitled Why Were Castles Built? And the answer they give here in the movie is accurate enough, okay? It doesn't answer everything. There's a lot more to the reasons why people built castles and why they were so useful, but, it is accurate, and I'm glad it's in the movie.
We must establish a garrison foothold here for our lines of supply from England.
So of course that makes taking the city crucially important, but not only that, it gives them a staging platform, a place of security, and robs their enemy. All of that, a staging platform, a place of security to send out, people attacking them. To take land in the medieval period, you needed to take the fortifications, which was the castles and fortified towns and cities. They were the linchpin of these areas. If you just park an army in there, you're eventually going to succumb to exposure, supply problems, and all that stuff. A castle gives you a place to garrison your men and prevents an enemy from wiping out your men with ease. If you just have an army sitting out in the middle of nowhere who don't have fortifications, they are profoundly vulnerable. Put them behind fortifications, you can make the utility of one man as effective as 5 to 10. Okay, castles are force multipliers on the macro scale for armies. And that's all I will say on that. If you want more detail, please do go watch my dedicated video. But unfortunately, those are the only real positives I can mention about this part in the movie. And it's also unfortunate that it's so brief in the movie when the Siege of Harfleur was such a big and significant element of Henry's campaign that led up to the Battle of Agincourt. A massive missed opportunity, and poorly depicted as to what they did deign to show of this event. And also wholly inaccurate as well, because it shows them, besieging a large castle. It's actually a port city of very significant tactical and commercial advantage, okay? Harfleur was an important port city. The thing is, successfully capturing an important port city wasn't nearly enough. Henry V's whole intention of this was to reclaim many of the lands he felt was rightfully his, indeed, claim the entire French crown as rightfully his as well, so there was a lot more to do. The problem was the siege lasted much longer than what the English had hoped for. Harfleur wasn't fully destroyed, but most of its outer wall defences were a complete mess. Nearly every building was at least damaged and a good number of them destroyed, and it simply wasn't in a state, due to the siege, where the English could employ in defences, so they had to move and find a more suitable defensive location to house the army through the oncoming winter. So Henry needed a secure place for his army and couldn't afford another long drawn out siege, because now the French had amassed an army that could challenge them, and any more delay would give the French more time to raise more troops. So Henry and his army attempted to reach the English-controlled Calais. The thing is though, French forces followed them and tried to block their route north and to try and force a battle. Henry didn't want to fight the English. They were getting worn out and tired from a long siege, they were suffering from sickness, they were low on supplies, they were not fresh, ready, good to fight. But the French army finally caught up to them and they had no choice but to fight. So now we come to the great battle of this movie, the Battle of Agincourt. And there are some things that they tried to do accurately, and then other things they just completely go off the rails and make up as they go. His close friend and advisor that Henry brings along with him is a fictional character based off the Shakespearean tale. Now, the Shakespearean tale, I think, bases him off of one and some other historical figures, one of them having fought in the 100 Years' War, but Henry was familiar with battle. He had fought before, and the tactics being employed, well, of course it makes sense that he looked to his advisors, but the way it's depicted, it seems like Henry has no idea what to do and is just looking for help from anyone, and it's his advisor who comes in with some interesting kind of tactics. One of the tactics he brings up is something that is very important and significant to the historical record, and that is that the battlefield on the actual day was very muddy and that the French got bogged down in it. So that's an accurate element, but as to how they execute and depict that, I'm a bit more disappointed with. Again, this is Hollywood, and you know, Hollywood, they want a big fight of men actually in the fray, and so because of that, it feels like they really underplayed the role that the archers had in this battle. They have the archers firing, but a lot of the French knights seem mostly unfazed by it. A couple of them drop to it, and they're like, nah, that's fine, we'll just keep going. And then they have a main engagement of the French into the English men-at-arms and knights who are on foot. After that, there's like only one or two more volleys from the archers. For how significant the archers were in this battle, it is really disappointing to how little they are featured in this battle itself. And for the most part, they're trying to put a spotlight on the gritty, grimy fight between the knights in armor and stuff like that. When, no, this wasn't actually how the battle played out historically. There was melee fighting, don't get me wrong, okay? But the way it came to that was very different than what they're showing here in the movie. In the movie, they're putting their men-at-arms and knights ahead of not only the archers, but then they had them march forward to try and lure out the French into a large assault that the French would be reluctant to commit all their forces. And for what reasons, okay? The French, historically, were not reluctant to commit all their forces because they felt it was a sure-gone victory. There was also a lack of cohesive leadership amongst the French as well. The French forces were supposed to be commanded by the leader, Charles d'Aulbray, the Constable of France, but it seems like there were certain other elements of the French army that just did their own thing. There was a bit of confusion, and the French all committed to a massive front-on assault. Now, the French had a massive army, but the whole army didn't actually attack. Who did attack? It was the mounted knights, and the number was between 10 to 12,000. Now, the number of the whole French army is said to be larger than that, but from the accounts and from people who actually study this, between 10 and 12,000 French knights were actually in the fighting itself, and any larger numbers than that would account for the numbers of the French that didn't engage. engage. Still, 10 to 12,000 was much larger than the English numbers, which was between 6 to 9,000. Now, even though we don't know the exact numbers, if it was 6,000, 9,000 or something in between, what we do know is that the makeup of the English army was something like 4 to 5 archers for every 1 man-at-arms or knight. So one of the big inaccuracies that I find in this battle is that the English knights engage the French cavalry by themselves without the backup of the English longbowmen. It's hard to know exactly how this battle played out, but there are certain things authorities on the matter are far more confident on than other things. One of those things is how the archers were used, the way they shot, which is directly contrary to how they are depicted in this battle. Here in this battle, it is shown that the longbowmen shoot large arching volleys upon the French knights, and that is mostly inaccurate from what many authorities on the matter have been able to figure out in studying this. In fact, I'll let Tobias Kappel answer this for us. He is the curator of the Wallace Museum, and this is from a video that is made and featured on Todd's Workshop YouTube channel. Phenomenal YouTube channel. I've given him a shout out before and did a whole video reply talking about one of his awesome tests he did regarding longbow versus plate armor, and that is uniquely informative for the subject we're talking about right now, the Battle of Agincourt, because that's the point of history in which they're basing the test on. But one of the followers' videos is Dr. Capwell talking about how the English longbowmen shot their bows.
The example of the collision and the conflict in everybody's minds about this battle between myth and misconception and facts is, for example, the very popular idea that the English shot up in the air. There's all this very dramatic Hollywood footage of archers aiming up in the air and launching arrows high in the air so that they drop down at long range on the enemy. And that's visually appealing in a film, and the image of a rain of arrows is poetic and everything, but it's not what happened. We have visual sources of the time, pictorial art, which gives us a sense of what these people looked like and how they shot. They're shooting straight, not up in the air.
So thank you for Tobias and of course Todd from Todd's Workshop for the work they have done and the small clip I've featured from their video. If you want to see the full video, link in the description and to Todd's channel as well. So the English shot straight, not in huge volleys. So what we can infer from that is that the French was able to get into a decent level of close range, not like, you know, where they're adjacent, but close enough to the point where these longbows would do maximum damage. And then shooting a massive volley into the French oncoming knights, well, my own opinion now is if they were aiming for the horses, they could come close to stalling that French charge completely. Because one of the interesting things that Todd and Tobias found out in the test that they did on Todd's Workshop is that a high-powered English longbow cannot penetrate plate armor made of this period if it's shot flat on the plates. As to the sides, well, there's going to be future tests that we'll be able to find out. But if it got in the gaps of the armor, it would definitely penetrate. Shrapnel would have been very dangerous to consider, and though no tests have been done to confirm this, horses aren't going to like being pummeled with high-powered bows either. Now, armor for horses did exist for this period, and it usually covered the head, neck, and kind of front chest of the horse, but it was expensive, and most knights didn't have it for their horses. Getting a suit of armor for yourself was expensive enough, so we could certainly see that some French knights would have had armor for their horses, but not nearly all of them. And even if the horses do have armor, it isn't like full-plate armor that protects the entire horse. There are many vulnerable areas. And if you shoot these horses with enough high-powered bows, they are going to drop. The other element about the historicity of this fight scene is the role in which the soggy ground played, okay? One of the interpretations is that the horses of the French actually got bogged down in the mud to slow their charge, not to the point where they got completely stuck and couldn't move. And the idea that is put forward in the movie that the English will fight in light armor and the French in heavy armor and the French will sink as a result and the English won't is a bit silly, okay? Is the ground is soggy enough to the point where you can sink in it, the weight of an average man will be enough to sink your feet down. Now, granted, heavy armor will make you sink more, but medieval armor isn't nearly as heavy as people suppose, and the idea that the English wouldn't be hampered by the soggy ground at all and the French would is a little ridiculous. Remember, the English also had armored knights. Now, it's a misconception to think that the English won purely through arrow fire. The longbowmen played a very significant role, but there was definitely one-on-one fighting. But to the level that the one-on-one fighting is shown in the movie is too much, in my opinion. The longbowmen in this movie do not have nearly a significant effect as they should have had according to historical record. The accurate depiction of this fight would have gone something like the French charging forward, getting bogged down. Horses are much heavier than, regular people, so the horses would have sunk a lot deeper in the bog than regular armored men. That would have slowed down their charge. The English waited for the French to get into close enough range to maximize their damage from their longbows, and they shot straight, not in large long-range volleys, and that, combined with the soggy ground, basically stalled the French's charge completely, and then the longbowmen continued to shoot into the French lines as much as possible. The French would have closed the distance eventually, even while getting pummeled. Remember, these are armored knights still. Even if they get dismounted and lose their horse, they're still wearing armor, and that armor is very effective against arrow fire. Many still would have fallen with arrows finding their gaps, absolutely, but the French still would have closed the distance, and when that distance is closed, that is when the English knights are ready to fight, and is also when the English longbowmen would not be able to fire anymore because there would have been a chance of hitting their own men. And so that is when the English longbowmen would drop their bows, pull out their weapons, run in, and fight in melee, right after the French had lost a very significant number. There is no accounts of the English laying in wait off to the sides in the bushes to try and flank the French. No accounts at all. So from my understanding, that didn't happen, and is again another inaccuracy in this battle. Now, once everyone is engaged, the depiction of the battle is very brutal, and I do give it, 2 thumbs up. It is messy, it is muddy, it would be in the bog, but the English would be just as disadvantaged as the French at this stage, in the bog. And to say that the English have a higher chance of slipping over because they're wearing full plate armor is also a bit nonsensical, because they would be wearing shoes that have a measure of grip. So this shot here where we see French Prince Louis ready to fight King Henry V, and that he slips over completely because of his armor, is again silly. Henry is also wearing armor. It's not full plate armor, but mail can be as heavy as full plate armor. It's still metal, okay? And so the only reason why someone would slip over that bad is if they're not wearing shoes that are that grip. But granted, this is so muddy that even shoes with tacks on the bottom would still slip around, but then so would Henry, okay? He looks to be wearing armor that is decently heavy. Maybe not as heavy as Prince Louis, but still pretty heavy, and that is not slipping at all, and then Prince Louis is completely a bit silly and unrealistic. This is one interpretation of this battle based on the historical evidence. Is it absolutely accurate? I have no idea. I concede that authority to someone like Tobias Capwell. Could have been that the French tried to retreat after getting stalled in their charge. But some of the things that we are far more certain of is that there was no long-range volleys. The English men-at-arms and knights did not advance outside of ranks so far ahead of the English archers to draw out the French like they are shown in this battle. So that is a great look at the historically great, but in the movie not so great, Battle of Agincourt in The King, and it is largely disappointing to me. Now, as to the weapons they're using, yeah, that's great. We see polearms, we see period-accurate swords. Again, I think the armor Henry is wearing is an absolute atrocity for a king. I mean, it's just garbage, okay? But I love that we see a lot of gambesons, and that the French knights were wearing, full plate armor. I think the full plate armor was pretty sloppily made. They didn't look tailored. I think a lot of their helmets were inaccurate. The coifs were all loose and not fitting properly. But the actual fighting when it started was brutal, and they showed that it was very muddy, which was accurate. They just didn't depict how the mud affected combat in a realistic way, in my opinion. And so then we have really come to the end of my review of The King. I mean, there are other things that happen towards the end of the movie which I've already kind of criticized about, like the revelation that Henry was manipulated into this war, which was bullcrap. Henry did end up marrying the daughter of the King of France, Charles VI, but that was actually something Henry had proposed before he'd even gone to war, and it seems like that was reverted to by Charles after he had seen how much Henry had just basically destroyed them. And then Henry was able to claim the crown of France. I find it interesting with how many liberties they took with the daughter of Charles VI, the future wife of Henry, and how they use her to depict Henry being not only weak, but easily manipulative and pathetic And honestly, this scene really annoys me because it is very inaccurate, okay? If you actually want to pick time periods and where there was far more inequality amongst the genders, well, the medieval period actually does a lot better than other time periods, but there was certainly a lot more in that period than the modern day. Just when you compare that period to other historical periods, you'd probably be surprised how many freedoms women actually had. But when it came to political marriages, I find it very unrealistic to how spiteful and insulting the daughter of the French king is being towards Henry at this time. Henry just conquered France, and it's through this marriage that any type of peace would be able to be achieved going into the future. Or peace without conflict, I should say. And she would know that. She would absolutely have been far more submissive to Henry to try and make the most out of this marriage and not be so insultive and combative. But this is, I think, modern sensibilities being injected into a historical period where women have to be strong, and the man who just conquered a nation is depicted as being weak and manipulatable and pathetic.
It would seem that you have no explanation for what you have done. You have shed the blood of so many Christian souls, and yet before me now all I see is a young and vain and foolish man so easily riled, so easily beguiled.
And that is how they are trying to depict Henry V in this movie. Young, vain, easily beguiled, weak. Now, don't get me wrong, there are points where Henry acts with, strong assertion, stuff like that, but nowhere near as decisively as he seems to have really acted historically. And the way that this lady spoke to him, for the period and the circumstances, I find profoundly unrealistic. Now, like I said, there are multiple ways of trying to interpret how this could have gone. And one is the submissive way, that she wanted to make the best out of this situation and gain France any advantage through the marriage. But I do fully admit she could have hated him for coming in and conquering much of her own nation. And if she hated him, again, I feel it's very unlikely that she would speak to him like this, because I feel she would then be scared witless of him because you just conquered your whole nation. Your life is in his hands. If you really tick off this guy, he can execute you for any number of reasons that he can just pick out of the sky like Henry VIII did. And even though I said there are moments where Henry acts, decisively and with strength, the final comment on his character are these statements by this lady, which is then confirmed when Henry confronts his main counselor throughout the movie, and it's revealed that the counselor manipulated the whole thing. This whole scene with Henry's future wife is bullcrap on not only what I've pointed out, there are some other howlers of inaccuracies that someone of her position and upbringing would never say, in my opinion.
All monarchy is illegitimate.
Wow, the movie is trying to show a French princess saying all monarchy is illegitimate. That is a completely modern opinion, not held by everyone, injected into a historical movie. That is absolute bullcrap. And for a historical film like this, okay, injecting modern sensibilities is deplorable, in my opinion. Now, she might think Henry's conquest of France was illegitimate. She might even think her own father's rule is illegitimate and agree with him. But for a French princess raised to be a princess with her father's authority and with the authority of monarchies in all the lands round about, to think that all monarchy is illegitimate is absolutely ridiculous. Come off it!
Indeed, there must be for you to contemplate marriage to a woman about whom you know so little.
Oh, gee, there's a lot to break down just for that. So she says she can't speak English, and then she does speak English. Either the writers are complete idiots and decide to forget that part, or they already portray this French lady as being a complete liar, which does not paint her in a positive light. But going off what she says later on, well, she's a horrible character already. And then she states that contemplating marriage to a woman that you know so little about as something foreign, when arranged marriages was the absolute norm for monarchy like this. Heavens, her older sister had married the previous English king, Richard II, when she was 6 years old. This is not a strange thing, yet they're showing it to be a strange thing. Arranged marriages are much more strange to the Western world now. This is another example of modern sensibilities being injected into a historical film. This isn't strange, this is completely normal.
I will not submit to you. You must earn my respect.
There are a lot of women in arranged marriages who would never get away with saying something like that. If the husband was particularly weak, look, I think a woman could say that to her husband, I will not submit to you. But in this situation, with the power that Henry holds and what is just achieved, I personally feel she would never say something like that. She might hate him, but to actually antagonize this conqueror is just bonkers.
You have shed the blood of so many Christian souls.
And that statement is just wholly hypocritical, because the French were no strangers to warfare or declaring war. They had declared war against the English to reclaim lands that they felt were rightfully theirs, with the exact same level of justification that Henry had in his declaration of war against the French. Medieval people weren't exactly shy about going to war. In many instances, they kind of liked it. I do have a video on this, why medieval people loved war. Go check it out if you want to see the ins and outs. But warfare, in some instances, could be seen by medieval people as glorious and a way to gain great wealth and riches. And some people honestly enjoyed the fighting. The medieval mindset is different to the modern mindset, and this scene right here is such a profoundly and egregious example of injecting modern sentiments into a historical period which don't fit. So I know I said I was basically done previously, but now I am. I just needed to finish off, this review with one of the more egregious examples of inaccuracy, in my opinion. But there we go. This has been my hugely detailed review of The King, as it is now available on Netflix, and unfortunately I give it a big thumbs down. Don't like it, didn't enjoy it. Even from just a film point of view, the characters were bland and uninteresting, and the character ultimately depicted as being weak and manipulatable. And the battles were average. There was one half-decent fight scene, but it did have problems, and so please do share your thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to reading them, and of course, I look forward to seeing you in the next video. So until that time, farewell.